A high school girl in China went to see the doctors one day, asking to be prescribed birth control pills. Now, most Chinese parents forbid their kids from dating before universities, let alone sex, so one would expect her to be doing this in secret without her parents knowing. But you might be surprised to hear that she was actually accompanied by her mother. In fact, this was her mother's idea. Not because the mother was worried about her daughter getting pregnant. She knew her daughter wasn't sexually active. After all, she strictly enforced the no dating rule in her daughter's life. Rather, the mother wanted to use the birth control pills to delay her daughter's period for a month, because the national exam in China will take place next month, and she didn't want her daughter's menstrual cycles to affect her exam performance. Now, that's actually not even amongst the most extreme things Chinese people do when it comes to exams. China already has an intense exam culture to begin with, but when it comes to the national exams, specifically the Gaokao, things get taken to the extreme. Gaokao is the Chinese national college entrance exam. It's the largest exam, not only in China, but also the world. In terms of the number of participants, it's at least 7 times the size of the SAT. It occurs once a year and lasts for 2 to 3 days. It's for high school graduates whose performance on this exam will determine which universities they can go to. For most Chinese people, this exam represents one of the biggest events in their lives. Chinese students are often taught since first grade that before graduating high school, their entire purpose in life should be to prepare for the Gaokao. The reason this exam is treated so seriously is because of how high the stakes are perceived to be. There's a common perception in China that if you do well on the Gaokao, you're set for life. But if you do poorly, you're fucked for life. And many Chinese families, especially those with lower socioeconomic status, consider Gaokao to be their only chance of economic advancement. That is, if their children do well on this exam, they can go to a good university and get a good job. But if their children don't do well, then they're stuck at the bottom for another generation. And as a result of the one-child policy, for the last 2 to 3 decades, most families in China only had one child to take this exam. This means that most Chinese students are single-handedly shouldering their entire family's prospect. And if their entire family's prospects are to be determined by their performance on this one exam, one can imagine how stressful it can be. In fact, Gaokao is often referred to as the hardest exam in the world for this reason, meaning that it's the most competitive and stressful. Now, due to the perceived high stakes, Gaokao operates with extreme stringency. For example, the exam papers are treated with such secrecy that it looks like an overt espionage operation. The test questions are designed by selected groups of senior teachers from secondary schools and universities. They have to go through secrecy maintenance training first before being transported to remote locations like military facilities where they would design the test questions. And during this time, they could not access the internet and are only allowed to contact their families. Once the test questions are created, the test papers are then printed in prisons under strict surveillance, then transported in armored vehicles with more security than banks transporting cash. During the days that the exam take place, it is as if there is a national event in China. The police presence is increased in cities, especially around the test sites and major routes used for student commute. Certain business operations are also paused, such as building constructions at certain locations so that the exams won't be disturbed. Now, the sheer psychological distress caused by the high intensity of Gaokao can have devastating consequences for students. For example, you're probably not surprised to hear that research has found an increase in mental health issues in students before Gaokao. And here's a chart of some of the common ones reported by students. The intense psychological stress, and perhaps along with the need to be constantly sitting down and studying, has caused physical health issues as well, sometimes causing these adolescents to have symptoms that are found in older adults, such as fatty livers and hypertension. In the most extreme cases, some students resort to permanent solutions to temporary problems, either before the exam due to sheer stress, or after the exam after seeing unfavorable results. And unfortunately, this isn't rare. And one can see reports of such cases on newspaper every year around the exam time. So much so that this can be observed in the language with which these cases are reported. Take, for instance, this 2018 news report on one such tragedy. Quote, "This is likely the first such incident of 2018 Gaokao period." Likely the first of 2018. Right? This phrasing is somewhat disturbing. They're not saying this horrible thing happened. They're saying this is the first of the year, meaning that they've seen this happen in previous years and they're expecting more this year. And this is just the first. Right? This is not a report of one unfortunate case. It's a report of a milestone in an ongoing pattern. And the reasons the students take such permanent measures to their temporary problems is probably because they don't perceive the problem as temporary. This has a lot to do with how this exam is presented to the students and perceived in the culture. Namely, if you do well on this exam, you're set for the rest of your life, but if you do poorly, you're fucked for the rest of your life. This kind of cultural attitude towards Gaokao means that some students could perceive the consequences of this exam as permanent and proceed to think that it requires permanent solutions. Now, part of this extreme exam culture comes from history. China started having national exams more than 1,000 years ago. It was something called the imperial exam, or Keju, introduced in the 600 AD during the Sui dynasty. The imperial exam was the first institutionalized national exam system in human history. I don't know if I should be proud or embarrassed by this fact, but if you ever wonder why Chinese people seem to have such a thing for exams, it's probably because we invented that shit. Now, the imperial exam was a highly structured process to select civil servants from the general populations based on their knowledge and abilities. Similar to the present-day Gaokao, many people at the time considered the imperial exam to be their only opportunity at economic advancement, but the imperial exam was in many ways much more hardcore than the Gaokao. When writing the imperial exam, for instance, the examinees were essentially locked in a cell for days, during which they had to work on this exam nonstop. And sometimes people died from it. And that happened with enough regularity that the exam officials had an informal protocol for what to do when that happens. And it was to, quote, wrap the body in a straw matting and throw it over the wall, end quote. Apart from the brutal exam itself, Chinese history was also full of stories of how hard people pushed themselves to study at the expense of their health. Some of these stories even predates the imperial exam. For example, there's the story of San Jing, a scholar from the Western Han dynasty who was so dedicated to studying that he would tie his hair to the ceiling with a rope so that whenever he started to nod off when studying, his hair would pull on his scalp and jolt him awake so that he could keep studying. And then there's the story of Su Qing, a scholar from the Warring States period. To keep himself awake and alert during long nights of study, he would stab himself in the leg with an awl, which is this sharp stick needle thing. And he would do that whenever he felt his focus slipping. Now, I don't know what these people were thinking. When I feel sleepy, I just drink coffee. So these stories obviously sound horrifying to me now, and if I have kids and they start behaving like this, I will be very concerned and I would try to intervene as to stop them from these self-harm behaviors. But when I first heard these stories as a kid in China, it didn't occur to me that they were extreme or unhealthy in any way. Because in China, these stories are taught to kids as exemplary models of self-discipline, perseverance, and hard work, with the characters in these stories framed as role models to look up to. Now, to be clear, Chinese schools are not explicitly teaching students to hang their hair up onto the ceiling or stab themselves as studying techniques. Nonetheless, this ideal of extreme effort is very much encouraged and embedded in the Chinese exam culture. Now, the negative impact of Chinese exam culture is far-reaching. It doesn't just stop when the Gaokao is over. Rather, it can stay with the students as they progress into adulthood. This is mainly because Gaokao is teaching students the wrong things in the wrong way. Now, the wrong thing part is perhaps more obvious, and a lot of this is not only issues with the Chinese education system, but modern education system in general. For example, I'm not the first to observe that a lot of the things taught in schools are completely useless in real life. The fact that so many Chinese students are putting in so much effort to acquire knowledge that will be completely useless after they complete the Gaokao exams is sad. The Gaokao is also a rigid, rule-based process designed for structured problem solving in narrow domains. This is the exact kind of processes that narrow AIs excel at. At the same time, the kind of skills that narrow AIs can do, such as creativity, adaptability, strategic thinking, originality, these are the exact kind of qualities that Chinese exam culture actively discourages. This means that as students prepare for Gaokao, they're developing themselves into the exact kind of specialists that are poised to be replaced by AI in the job market. Now, the unemployment problems in China is complex. There are various levels of causalities involved, but I would speculate that the Chinese exam culture is at least partly responsible. Now, not only is Gaokao teaching the students the wrong things, the way that they are taught to students also have negative consequences. Studying for Gaokao involves a classical textbook learning approach. You've got teachers and tutors and textbooks. These are the official sources of information, and you are only to get your information from these official sources. Don't follow your intuition and curiosity by looking elsewhere. Don't be creative and try new things and experiment. Just take the information that is spoon-fed to you from the official sources and swallow. But that's not how learning in the real world works. When I need to learn something at work, for instance, there's no textbook, no lectures, no tutors. There are no official sources of correct answers. I will need to find the information myself, and that often involves reading a Reddit post written by some shady dudes that make sense only 50% of the time. And then I will have to try it out, experiment to see if it works, and then most likely won't work, and then I'd have to observe the way in which it fails to work and use that as data to structure my subsequent searches for the right answers. In other words, it's a process of trial and error iteration that is sorely missing in the way one studies for Gaokao. In fact, Gaokao teaches you the exact opposite intuition when it comes to learning. Right? Don't experiment. Don't be creative. Just do what you're told. In other words, not only does Gaokao actively discourages what works in the real world, it also actively teaches exactly what doesn't work in the real world. Right? It's a 1-2 punch that KOs the student's future. And it does that by teaching them these very bad habits that they will have to unlearn once they enter the workforce. Now, when it comes to the workforce, we will need to discuss Chinese work culture. Now, Chinese work culture can look like an extension of the Chinese exam culture, but it's actually more sinister with some key differences. Because now that money is involved, there's an incentive for bad actors to manipulate and take advantage of people. This is where the rich can structure the rat race in such a way as to extract productivity from its participants while keeping them distracted by their competition with each other. And because Chinese people were in this kind of cutthroat competition since childhood as a result of the exam culture, they often don't recognize that they're being taken advantage of because they're kind of used to being worked to the brink of burnout. Now, Chinese work culture is a bigger topic that requires a separate video, and I'll probably do a video on the Chinese work culture. I'll probably start working on that once I finish this one. One thing I've started doing recently, though, is to release interesting findings about the topic I'm working on onto my Patreon as I'm working on it. So I might have already made some posts about the Chinese work culture there, depending on when you watch this video. So check that out if you're interested in supporting and following my work more closely. Link is in the description. Now, despite all of the shortcomings of the Chinese exam culture, it is not unilaterally bad. There are some good things about Gaokao and some positive shifts in the Chinese exam culture as well. Regarding Gaokao, although it is rigid, it is fair in the sense that it is in principle a meritocracy. It doles out opportunities based on performance instead of socioeconomic backgrounds. In other words, students from the poor families have the same shot at Gaokao as those from the rich families. So it balances out the playing field and promotes social mobility to some degree. Now, it doesn't balance out the playing field perfectly. The kids from the rich family will still have more opportunities in general. Even if they do poorly on the Gaokao, they can get into an okay university and get a good job through family connections, for instance. So Gaokao isn't perfect, but it's at least on the right track. And although Gaokao teaches students a lot of bad instincts, it also teaches them discipline and perseverance and how to push through resistance and hard work. And in addition, to provide some hope in the future of humanity, the Chinese exam culture is shifting. The reason Chinese people have this die-hard attitude towards Gaokao is because they perceive the stake to be absolute. Namely, this attitude of you either do well on this exam and be set up for life, or you do poorly and you're fucked. But that's not true. Now, the stake is high, but not absolute. There are alternatives to doing well on the Gaokao, namely this track of university and white-collar work. For example, you can go to trade school and have blue-collar work. Now, traditionally, Chinese people don't like blue-collar work. They look down on it culturally, and practically blue-collar work indeed pay less than white-collar work in the past. But recently, that seems to be changing. There's a CNA report that shows that the pay discrepancy between blue and white-collar work is shrinking in the past decade, with some anecdotal stories of Chinese university graduates leaving their office job for blue-collar work and ending up with a higher salary. The bad perception of blue-collar work still exists in China, although some Chinese Gen Zs are working to change that narrative, which is inspiring to see. And as the cultural perceptions around the various alternatives to Gaokao change, it will hopefully balance out the extreme Chinese exam culture as well.